Welcome, everybody, to our Soulcast Media live event. It is so fantastic seeing you all. I was behind the scenes looking at all the names, all the cities you all are dialing in from, and how amazing is this? I always say, I love and I look forward to putting on events like this because it's just a great way to connect with folks virtually, and we can be really anywhere around the world. I'm here in California. I know my guest, Sally, she's dialing in from New York City, but again, we have folks internationally, which is so fantastic. So, first of all, I just want to give a big, warm welcome to all of you and to say we have so much good stuff in store for you today. You all here because we're going to be talking about something that I'm quite excited about. We're talking about finding work-life happiness. And, but behind the scenes here, Sally and I were talking about what would be some of the things we would be talking about and things we want to share with you. And it's funny because I feel like sometimes we know work life happiness is important, but a lot of times because we are so busy with work, we can't or we don't have the time to carve out what does this exactly mean to us. I personally have always heard the term, you probably all heard of it, like work life balance, but I've always liked to change that last word to happiness because I always feel like isn't that kind of what it is. So again, we have so much in store for you and I just want to welcome you. And by the way, before we get started, let's do a quick like tech stuff. So sometimes with the internet, you never know, but if there's anything with the internet where I'm frozen or you're seeing some funny glitches, if you just refresh, it'll bring you back to where we are because yes, we are dialing in live. And I want to know and let you know. So, as much as this is a conversation between Sally and I, this is a conversation that we want you to be involved with as well. Meaning, you all know that there's a chat function here. And if you have any thoughts, any comments, any questions, we want to help answer it because, as grateful as we are, we want you to know that this is for you. So, before we get started, I also want to do a quick intro of who I am. If this is the first time we are meeting, I want to say I'm so glad you're here. If you've attended my many Soulcast Media lives, then you know what these are about. But if not, my name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Soulcast Media, and we are a communications training company. We've been around for about 4 or 5 years now, but prior to Soulcast Media, my whole career was on TV. I was a television journalist for about 10 years, all around the country, New York. I started my first job was at the NBC station in Reno, Nevada. My last stop was at ABC in San Diego, California, which was actually where I won an Emmy Award. And it's funny because a lot of people go, well, you won an Emmy Award. Like, what do you want to do? You can kind of like do anything that you want. But that for me was a pivotal moment of also work life happiness where I felt like I had learned so much in the world of television that I was like, you know what? It would make me so happy to take all that I learned on TV, communications, and teach it to professionals because I'm not shy about sharing with folks that for me personally, I'm quite an introvert. I'm fairly shy and timid. So, if you can imagine, when you work in TV or in the media industry, you really have to learn how to be a great communicator. And I found out that there's so much that I learned that I could teach it to folks. So I'm very proud to say that I've taught over 2 million people now how to improve their communications. And part of hosting events like this is to have us continue thinking about work, about communications, and how we can just bring our best selves to work. So, with that, let's get started. I'm thrilled to start off our conversation about work life happiness, and I'm very excited and proud to introduce my guest. Her name is Sally Wolf, and and she'll tell you her story, but it's so incredible. But she's a speaker, a well being advocate, and she's all things about positive psychology and helping us bring our best selves to work. So, you bet we are going to be talking about how we can get into that mindset. So, yes, we can find that happiness. But what does that mean? We'll have Sally talk about it. So, I'm very thrilled to bring Sally up here. So, Sally, welcome to Soulcast Media Live.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. And you were so full service. I was just going to hit unmute for myself, and it's like the host has already unmuted you. So We are ready to go.
Yeah, no, for all of you, I'm doing everything behind the scenes as I'm chatting with you. So, Sally, I know I did a quick intro of who you are and the work you do, but please tell our audience, yeah, what is it that you do and even your story. I feel like your story is so powerful.
Sure. And I love hearing your background. And I think this is the first time I've been interviewed by an Emmy Award winning media person. And I have a media background as well, but on the business side. So I love that we're having this conversation. So first of all, I was seeing the chat and I have it closed now so that I can concentrate, but I see a few friends tuned in and folks from all over the world. So that is awesome. I am in New York and I have been a lifelong New Yorker. You may or may not hear a siren in the background, like literally on cue as soon as I started talking. I had spent about 20 years in the media industry, both management consulting, a little bit of banking, and then mostly in house at big and small companies, and really had the opportunity to understand the corporate world in all sort of ways, shapes and forms, very much client driven, client focused. And I had hit that point. This goes back about 8 years. I turned 40 and I was like, I don't know if I'm feeling this anymore. And we're going to talk today about work life balance or happiness, or I talk a lot about meaning and purpose. And I just, I don't know why, but there's something about these birthdays divisible by 10. It's like, let's reflect on our life at this moment, as opposed to why don't we learn to do that all the time? And so I had started to think through, is this really where I still want to be? Like, I've made it. I'm an executive at the time
Mhm.
I was at Time Warner. I also have been at NBC Universal. So we've probably kind of crossed paths many times. And the answer wasn't yes anymore. It
Mhm.
wasn't clarity on this feels right to me anymore. And then as I was trying to figure out like what, and I should say, I had the best boss I'd ever had. I had the best job I had ever had. I had created an incubator for storytellers at Time Warner to elevate diverse voices. And I really was proud of it. And I still am. And so it was like there were pieces that felt right,
Mhm.
but I wasn't waking up every day thinking this is where I'm meant to be. And I kind of wanted to lean more into that feeling. And so I started to explore it. And then life handed me the wild card of a cancer diagnosis. So before I had gotten very far into, like, I knew I wasn't where I wanted to be, but I didn't know where I did want to be. Right. And those are two equally important things to figure out. And so I had this diagnosis, and I think a lot about the opportunities that exist alongside obstacles. And I think we'll kind of circle back to that theme because it's where a lot of growth opportunity exists for all of us. And so here I was going to have surgery. I was going to have several months of chemo, and I had the gift of medical leave. And that was really a gift of time. And as you know from the corporate space,
Mhm.
we don't always have a lot of time to pursue and figure out what do I want. And so I took a deep dive into positive psychology. I took a course I had had my eye on for a while, and I was learning about all these things like meaning and purpose and growth mindset and energy flow and physical vitality. And I in some ways was going through a cancer journey that was real, and I was also feeling pulled and called and inspired by all of this material. And so that really planted the seed for what I do now, which is to combine that corporate background
Mhm.
with this positive psychology deep dive, because that one course became two, became many. And I work with corporate clients, with executives and their teams, anything from like inspirational town hall talks to workshops to one on one coaching, but really helping people to thrive and flourish and live their best lives.
What I love about what you said, and I want to point this out, the fact that we're all here and, because I host these every other week and our topics are pretty different, though it's always professional and workplace related. But I always find that depending on, of course, what the topic is, it really gathers like-minded individuals here because we are all similarly interested in this topic. And there's probably many reasons why this topic, the fact that you are all here and listening, that something about this topic is calling to you where you're like, Maybe something happened at work recently. Maybe it's something that you've been thinking about for a while now, but something about this work life happiness triggered something in you for you to be like, you know what, let me just kind of take a listen and see what this is all about. So, one point in particular, Sally, that I want to go back to because I thought it was so powerful was your thinking of obstacles being opportunities. Now, for most of us, when we hit obstacles, we get stressed, we get anxious, we feel like it's completely derailing us from the plan that we had, whatever that plan is, right? And for some of us, we're like, oh my gosh, it's just gonna set us back. But your perspective on it was you were reframing that a little bit. And I think for a lot of us here, we all have obstacles from time to time, whether they are big obstacles or just kind of little things like putting out fires here and there, maybe at home, maybe at work, projects don't go as planned. But how do you encourage somebody to not dwell in that negativity that obstacles can often bring? How do you get someone to be like, no, 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 it's actually a good thing? And how can you get them to also believe that too?
There are like 8 questions in there, and I love how your mind works, and I'll try to hit them all. But you're talking about the reframe. You're hitting on post traumatic growth, which is real. You're hitting on so many important things, and I think like that reframe, that first moment of, and I had said earlier that opportunity alongside the obstacle.
Mhm.
I don't want to ever suggest that is always it was something as big as cancer, for example, or a layoff, or something that's real, and that is challenging. And we do have this negativity. That was the other thing you said, this negativity bias in all of our brains because we
Yeah.
are all human. So in that moment, that is an obstacle. I don't want to sugarcoat that.
Mhm.
And when I talk about positive psychology and happiness, it's not that toxic positivity. So we may have a real obstacle, and it may be something that kicks us and feels like it kicks us in the gut hard.
Mhm.
What I know to also be true is that if we can find something in that moment or that day to feel gratitude for, gratitude gets a lot of attention, rightfully so, because we can immediately sort of right our like that lack of balance we feel when we feel like we've been knocked down. When we can say, okay, this is not what I would have chosen. This is really hard. This is going to be a challenge. All true. And I can tell you about the moment that one of the cancer diagnoses that I received. I vividly remember that day because it was a day in which I heard news no one would want, which was that my cancer had metastasized, which makes it a stage 4 cancer. But also, I remember being with a friend when I got that call. So I was grateful that I wasn't alone in that moment. And I remember that I got to go see my nephew, who 4 years earlier had made me an auntie, which, if any of you are connected to me on LinkedIn, you know that is part of my LinkedIn title. Is like my favorite thing to do is to auntie. It's a verb.
To
And so I
answer.
got right? And so I got to go get a little, like a little big hug, right? And I went through that day, a day in which I heard the news that I thought would absolutely, like, it was game over. That's what I thought would happen. We all are good at thinking we know what will happen in that moment. But actually, that day was full of lots of little moments of awesome light. And so that requires the ability to tune into gratitude, to say, I am grateful for this. I would not have chosen this thing that happened. And also at the same time, it's a both end. And I think that is the dance that we really need to ask ourselves to do in a lot of these difficult moments. You hit on the negativity bias, and I want to just, or you hit on negativity and like where our brains go, and we are wired for that,
Yeah.
like our brains. And I'm sure you've hit it in I've caught some of your episodes, not all, because our brains, a lot of people who are well versed in this will come back to the fact that we have tens of thousands of thoughts a day, most of
Mhm.
them unconscious, and an incredibly high number of them have a negative element to it. It's what kept us safe, right? And so that reframe that you alluded to is important, because how often do we say something like, I feel overwhelmed, or I feel stressed, or I don't want to feel stressed, right? It's always choosing that word that is like the darker word, or I try not to label things good or bad, but like the bad thing that we don't want. What if we said, I desire, and you talked about this earlier, I desire balance, I desire happiness, I desire calm. I desire, right? Like, I don't want this. That is how we are wired to say things. But then what happens is our bodies are like literally listening to our internal dialogue, and they're hearing the word stress or overwhelm, right? They're not like hearing that like I don't want or I don't desire. And even if they do, it's like that double negative. Like, I don't want this bad thing. Well, what about I want to feel calm? And then knowing like if I just feel my heartbeat or feel my belly breath, I can actually take a step to get myself there, which is something I do, like, for example, in a PET scan. So all these things kind of come together because when we learn how to effectively coach ourselves or how to tune into that inner our hearts, right, that inner emotional dialogue, our guts, which have existed far longer than these overthinking brains that you and I and all of our listeners have. When we learn to better tune into our bodies, we really know what we want, I think, a lot more than what we think our brains tell us.
There's so much that I feel is so incredibly insightful about what you said. And the first one was, gratitude is a choice, right? But I get it. I think it's human nature to focus on the negatives. In fact, the negatives, the fear, that is a way for people to feel also urgency as well to get things done. I mean, think about the work that we're doing every day. This deadline we must hit, this angry client we must respond to, right? That anger, that negativity, it is a motivator in many ways because we got to respond to it, right? But the one thing that I've really discovered with the workplace in general is that we have to carve out these times for ourselves because many times just because of the construct of what work is, and it's not good or bad, right? It's just more like we have to take care of ourselves many times. I'm curious, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Sally, but for me, I don't have like a list of gratitude that I like. I know a lot of people sometimes will write gratitude lists before they go to sleep to reflect on their day. I've never been able to get into that, but what I have done is I have been journaling since I was probably 7 years old. What was I talking about when I was 7? I have no idea. But I have been journaling since I was 7. And I'm like, anytime there's something that I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed with, I'll grab my journal and I'll sit. I have like I call it my journaling chair, and I'll sit there. It's like this big comfy chair, and I'll just sit there and just like allow myself the time to just write. Sometimes it's like as short as 15 minutes. Sometimes I can journal for like an hour. But for me, this is a great way for me to practice reminding myself that despite all the noise, despite all the pressure, the deadlines, this moment that I'm carving out for myself is for myself. And I feel like that has helped me build that work-life happiness. What about for you, Sally? What do you do anything habits wise that's really helped you?
So I do. I dance a lot. And so I use the metaphor of dance also, like dancing through cancer, which I literally did, which I'll talk about in a second, but also because figuratively, like, our lives are that dance, right? Of like getting out of our heads, of you getting something on paper. I discovered dance. I was not a dancer. I will frame this. Like, I think I was like a ballet dropout at age 5. It's the only activity I remember dropping out of. So I am not a dancer by trade. And I discovered dance, and it was pole dancing classes in, I was just about 30, I think. So it was almost 2 decades ago. And a friend had invited a bunch of us to go on a whim. And I was like, I actually looked back because I ultimately fell so in love with this movement. And I looked back because I was like, I know I was not enthusiastic about this. And my whole response to her was, "You're hilarious, ha." Like, there is no way you're getting me on a stripper pole. And, then she persisted. Like, I've tried this out in LA. It's so much fun. And so I said, well, I am such a good friend that I will come with you because that is the type of friend I am. P.S. She dropped out after like 2 months. And, almost 20 years later, I'm like, I kid, I'm like a black belt stripper. But I also, share that because learning to literally talk with my body, which is what dance is, and really get in tune with myself through my body, through dance, not through this, overthinking head, was such a gift before cancer. for, just like as a sort of a balance for like I was a New Yorker, I was fast paced moving through my life, right? I was going from being an executive at the company to going to a dinner plan to going to something else after that. Every single thing was booked in my day. And suddenly I had a dance class where I had 2 hours. I didn't have my phone. I didn't get any notifications. And I could just move and quiet down my body and learn the emotional expression of things like anger, which you mentioned earlier, right? How does that move through my body? What does happiness feel like in my body? Like what music brings about both? And learning that in a 4-minute song, usually by Sia, if you're me and you're DJing for yourself, you can get through that all. You can get anger and sadness and joy and bravery and all this stuff in like 2 to 4 minutes. And so what I do before I give a keynote, before I give a workshop, before I have an interview, whether it's like you or Good Morning America, whoever, I am doing a dance party by myself in my apartment or in a hotel room before a talk or in an elevator or in a bathroom stall if I have no other place to go, because I know that when I really feel aligned, none of the outside noise is going to distract me. And that's as true in a doctor's appointment as it is in the work that I do. It's like letting me tune into myself so that I can sort of balance myself out when the world around me is, I don't know who's going to tune in or what questions, right? You didn't send me a list of questions in advance, but I know that if I'm tuned into myself, it's going to go well. It's going to be good.
This reminds me of how happiness is very much a mindset. You know how when you watch athletes, so if they're, for example, about to go on and play basketball, you see a lot of them have these headphones on. They're probably listening to their hype music. That hype music gets them prepared. It kind of helps them shut off the world, any distractions, so they can get into that mode. By the way, I want to ask our audience here, when we talk about work life happiness, when I say those words and you're thinking about work life happiness, what is something that you do that can bring you that work life happiness? I shared that for me, it's journaling from time to time. Sally, you mentioned that it was being able to be a black belt dancer, but I'm curious, and please use the chat function actually, because I want to get your thoughts on this. And what I would encourage you is, when you write it out, that's how it can become like a real enriching discussion. And I would love to hear, what is it that when we talk about work life happiness and finding it, what does that entail? What do you have to do, right? Amanya, I see you're saying music does that for me too. So basically that analogy of like, oh, we see it, right? Those athletes, they put on music, maybe we'll close a door. For me, yeah, I love that too, as a way for me to kind of like tune out and just like be happy, right? Because again, I think in the working world, we have to carve out that time for ourselves, because it's not like we can always expect people to give us that permission. Pamela, you're saying gardening. Yes, absolutely. There's something so peaceful about that, right? Where you just go out, you tend to whatever it is that you've been working on. And not only that, you're seeing it grow. I feel like that must be, and because we know gardening is a very slow process too, right? You have to be very patient with the process of gardening. I feel there's so much peace to that. Reading, let's see, Sarah, you're saying reading. Absolutely. I'm all about cozying up in my big chair with a nice fresh book. I'm old school. I like reading the books.
Me
I don't
too.
know if are you like that, Sally?
Yeah, I don't own a Kindle. I really like I mean, I also will occasionally admit I will print things out if they're really long articles, and it's so bad for the environment, but I like that
Holding.
tactile, that feel. I also love that in a world where notifications are so hard to really quiet, books don't notify me. So if I'm holding an actual book, I can cozy up with it and I don't need to feel like right. Like I just like that, it's how I grew up, so to speak. And I really enjoy it. I'm like seeing some of the comments too about
Yes,
a lot of
Michelle,
notes.
reading and yoga, Vicky, crocheting. Oh my gosh, I like that. There's something very peaceful about being able to sit there. You can kind of just zone out or listen to music as you're doing it. Absolutely. I love that. Walk, hiking. Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it. Baking and cooking, exercise. Oh my gosh. This is so great. And I love seeing the variety too. Sally, I know you're seeing this too, but the variety of different activities. And here's the thing, like we have to carve out these opportunities for ourselves because so this is another thing. Sally, you and I were talking about this behind the scenes where it's like that working self and then the personal self, like the professional and the personal. But your perspective on this, Sally, was very interesting. Do you see it as two exclusive, separate things, the work life and then the personal life? How do you see these together?
We are one person, right? I am Sally, you are Jessica. And I have long believed, I never really understood that, like, this is your work self. This is your life. It was the advice I got when I graduated college. I went to one of these big, huge management consulting firms. I had a mentor, Susan, who was amazing. She was like 1 year ahead of me, right? So she had acquired all this wisdom in the 1 year after she graduated college. And she was saying, like, yeah, like, this is your work. So this is like, and I was like, wait, what? Because that is exhausting, in my opinion, to have to sort of check any part of ourselves at the door. And I think where people get a little tripped up is sometimes people think like, well, I don't want to tell everything to my coworkers. And you don't have to. Like Brene Brown, who I have long adored before she was like on HBO and on Oprah. I was like OG Brene fan. And she talks about how we share our stories with those who have earned the right to hear them. So, how deep we go into each of our stories, right? How much we share at work. Like, for example, I'll use my dance, right? We can choose how deep we go. But I used to, I told you it was pole dancing. I told you outright it was pole dancing because look, you may have tried it or someone in the chat may have connected. And so when I share, I find that other people share back. And at work, I was very open. Monday nights, I had pole dancing. And it meant that I did not fly to LA until Tuesday mornings until I would go a lot to LA for work. I worked in media unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't do Monday work dinners and I didn't work late. And if I had to pick something up later, that was what I did. But I was able to protect Mondays because my boss knew it was important to me and she knew what it was. And I remembered being in a dance class hearing a lot of my classmates would, this was a class. This was like something that was on ClassPass. Anyone could do it. But people thought it was like, it sounded scandalous. It was a stripper pole. So not only did they not tell some of their coworkers, some of them lied to their parents, lied to their friends. If you come to my birthday party, can you say we met at yoga? And I remember thinking, this doesn't elevate you. It doesn't let you feel good about what you're doing if you have to check it at the door. And that's especially true at work. And so I really believe that when we can bring and be our full selves wherever we go and lean into it, it actually inspires deep connection. We don't have to worry about, well, who knows what I'm doing, right? And we can layer it. Like, I'm not saying that everyone at Time Warner knew I had cancer the moment I was diagnosed. They didn't. But my boss knew 2 weeks before I was diagnosed. As soon as I had a scheduled biopsy, Lisa knew. I chose to tell her because in that moment, I knew I could either let this person who had earned my trust in and let her be an aid to me, let her know that I wasn't 100%, let her help me balance that, balance everything around me, and also have a caring heart next door to my office. Or I could choose to have those blinders on that so many people often choose in that moment, right? Not share. And in not sharing, I could just try to juggle everything as if it were normal. And by the way, anyone who's ever waited for a biopsy knows it's not normal when you're waiting for that. So
Okay. And I was gonna say, I love this story because, well, there's so many elements that I want to kind of dissect here. So, number one, you know, it's so amazing to hear about the relationship that you have with your manager and how you were able to develop such a close relationship where you could share. Because I imagine there might be many of us here who are like, I don't have that kind of closeness or comfort where I would be wanting to share. In what is powerful though about what you are able to do though, Sally, is because once you were able to open up, then you were able to also set boundaries, right? Instead of hiding. You know how you said that you're like, I'm always going to be not available Monday nights because that's when my classes are. But you're like, you know what? I'm going to proactively tell people about this so they know it, so they cannot try to sneakily schedule something, but they know I'm not going to be available. So you communicating what you're doing for yourself and why it's so beneficial to your happiness. I feel like, there's a lot of good people in the world. And if you explain that to them, I feel like they absolutely understand and they should respect that. And like I said, you had this relationship with your manager where you told her exactly what you're doing. Now, for those who are here who don't have that kind of openness, transparency, because maybe they feel like their boss wouldn't understand or they are afraid it might taint their credibility in some way when they are trying to set these boundaries, right, of finding work life happiness. How do you recommend, Sally, these folks approach these conversations where these boundaries are important for their own happiness? How can they set that with their manager and their colleagues? Because you're saying personal and professionals, they are intertwined together. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, look, each person listening to this is different. And also, everyone's in relationships with different people, different colleagues, different bosses, right? I don't think there's necessarily one succinct answer, other than I really do believe that communication and vulnerability, and I think a lot about vulnerability and authenticity, it really is a dance. And it's not always going to be led by the more senior person in the conversation. Some people, and I apologize if you hear that drilling. There's some work going on in the building, and I live in a high rise in New York City, and inevitably on cue, we're live. So now it just started. But any one of us can learn to build that muscle, first of all. So a lot of people think like, I'm not good at being vulnerable, or I don't know how, or this is hard, or it has to even be dark, right? Or about something difficult. And the reality is vulnerability, it's a muscle we can build or practice building by giving a compliment. Because what vulnerability is, it's about leaning into something, in this case, saying something, a compliment. You don't know how it'll be received, right? And so, or smiling at a stranger on the street, or complimenting your Starbucks barista. And so, when you start there with something that's probably it may not be fully comfortable, but it doesn't feel as tough, you start to open the door to being able to have more difficult conversations too. And so when we're talking about the workplace and maybe a difficult manager or colleague or whatever, or whoever it may be, I think like kindness can be really disarming, and openness and curiosity, right? We so often go to a place of judgment. This person is this way because whatever, right? And what if we were to lean into it with a little bit more curiosity and a little bit more of the belief? I saw this cartoon once on, I think it was on Facebook. Now I'm like so doubled down on LinkedIn, but back in the day on Facebook. And it was I never have been able to figure out who to credit with this, but I reference it because it is so telling. It is two panels. It is two stick figures, black and white. You don't even know what gender, you can't see any, just black and white stick figures. And in the first panel, one says to the other, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. Sounds a little dirty. You don't know where it's going to go. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. In the second panel, they both reveal these big, huge red hearts. That is the simplicity of vulnerability and of conversation and of this dance. You don't have to reveal everything, but if you're willing to take that risk, and I've done this and tried this firsthand in one of my jobs where I had a really tough manager, and he wasn't well liked, and he was sort of the opposite of that previous boss that I had discussed. And I had at the time already studied a lot of these tools, the reframe, the meaning and purpose, all of that. And so I started bringing that into the conversation, like on the side, right? It wasn't part of what we were talking about. We were talking about media, but I would ask some questions and we would chat and I would open up about myself. And one day he came into my office. He said, "How do you do it?" And he had never come into my office. And I was like, "How do I do what?" He goes, "Well, you're so open about your illness and you're so, this and that. And you share, and how do you do it?" And so I talked to him a little, but really it wasn't about me giving him tips. I said, "What's going on with you?" Because usually behind the facade of really tough person, really closed off, really like buttoned up, there's actually something deeper. Because what I know from positive psychology is that almost all of us want to connect and are wired to actually want to feel meaning and purpose at work and to lean into one another. And so when people are not doing that and they're almost like obviously not doing it, there's probably something going on and they're waiting for someone to, because they're not going to necessarily open up, but they're waiting for someone to chip away a little and to say, what's going on with you? And by the way, that guy, he changed overnight and he was generously giving me credit. And it wasn't that I did anything so uniquely spectacular, except for the fact that I asked a question that anyone could have asked him. But because of his demeanor, most people didn't.
I love your story about how sometimes we expect it would be our manager who has to open up first for us to feel comfortable opening up. And I love the tip of how we can actually open up ourselves first, even though our manager might be that buttoned up, very, strict and stiff kind of person. And we can do it in, I call it low stakes situations, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be in the meeting where like 5, 10 other colleagues are sitting there. Like, no, that's probably not the place to do it. But, it's these like side conversations, the one on one conversations where you can start off by just with the small talk, right? I mean, that's what it is, right? A lot of people think small talk is just a waste of time, but it's an opportunity for you to get to know other people and just, whether or not they want to share, you can share a little bit about yourself. I always talk about there are a few like universal things that many of us can connect with, whether it's food. I know there are some foodies in here, whether it's food or travel or a particular city, right? Just talking about that can open a side to us that can it's not even just about being professional, it's just showing some personality. I think because like I remember, I grew up in a very conservative and traditional household, and same thing, I was always told that there was like the working you and there was like the personal you, and there were two separate things. But I have found personally that the more I work, the more valuable it is to actually be able to share more about myself personally, and it does not discredit the credibility that I've built. And I think sometimes we can get so hyper focused on that. I want to just call out this comment. Ephraim, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. You're saying, as a man in our society, my self worth is closely tied to what I do for a living, especially in New York City. It's true in the sense that, like, how do we often introduce ourselves, right? It's like, what do you do? What's your title? But behind any of that facade, it's a person inside. And, I think growing up also in a very traditional household where hierarchy is very important, I used to only focus on people's title and be like, oh my God, it's so intimidating. I'm talking to the senior VP of X, Y, and Z. But the more that I've worked, the more I realize like it doesn't even matter what their title is. They're people at the end of the day. They're doing awesome work, but it doesn't mean I cannot connect with them. That's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, I've for gosh, as long as I can remember, really been agnostic to what someone's title is, because the reality is every person at an organization or wherever we go for that matter, but I grew up in the corporate world, um, has a reason to be there and has the opportunity to elevate you and connect. And I just love getting to know everyone because everyone has a story. And I'm sure as a journalist, with your background, you know that too from all of that experience. I had surgery in June and I was at HSS, which is a big hospital, I think based here in New York. I think it's elsewhere as well. And I posted on LinkedIn a video of my janitor serenading me. He's now on LinkedIn. I mean, for all I know, he might be listening in today because I told him to get on LinkedIn. But it's so much I love this space. But I just was chit chatting with him. I saw the care he was taking in his job. I know there is a study on janitors, and I don't know if you are familiar with it, janitors and purpose. So I'm just going to quick tangent because I think folks will love this. So there is a study that was done about 20 years ago in Michigan, janitors at hospitals, where a psychologist saw that some janitors felt really deep purpose in what they did and others didn't. And so naturally, she was curious. So she asked them, "What do you do?" And the janitors who felt no purpose, they would say things like, "I clean floors." Now, the other janitors at the same hospital, they also clean floors. But when she said, "What do you do?" their answers were vastly different. They would say things like, "I help patients to heal. I help people to be well." And they do. And so there are like newscasters have had incredible stories. They found these janitors where there's one in Tennessee. He was at a bone marrow clinic for kids and he noticed two little boys had Legos in their different respective rooms. They were immunocompromised, so they couldn't play together. But he noticed, he observed them, and he actually went back and forth and shared their different designs that they had made with Lego and ultimately coordinated. And they had a play date when they left because they felt connected. That janitor felt empowered to do that. Francis at HSS serenaded me. We were chit chatting, we were talking. I actually got very annoyed because a doctor walked in and was interrupting, like, kind of saw it and was like, "Well, I'm a doctor, so I'm gonna, no, like, this is," I was like, "I'm talking to Francis." And ultimately, a nurse saw that we were connecting and said, Do you know that Francis sings?" And I said, "No, I didn't know." And I asked him his favorite song. And he sang Smile to me, which I actually thought was originally a Michael Jackson song, but I didn't realize Michael Jackson had covered it. Regardless, Francis sang that to me and with such a smile. And I posted it with his permission on LinkedIn. And I'm sharing this full story because the CEO of HSS, who I did not know, reposted it, along with countless other HSS folks who wrote things like, "I worked there for years. I left there 5 years ago. Francis still texts me every day to see how I'm doing." And so this is the janitor at the hospital. And so this is a very long answer, but I share it because every single person wherever we are can be our teacher, can be our source of inspiration, can be a source of connection. If I were to send someone to go have a similar surgery, if they needed what I had, and I were to tell them about HSS, Francis is one of the first people I would talk about, right? Not just the surgeon.
Sally, that story where it reminds me of how a lot of it is perspective and what we choose to see, right? You could have easily just been like, "Ugh, I got to go to the hospital. I got to get treatment. I don't want to be here. I'm so sad," right? But you chose to acknowledge and notice other people. And as a result, look at that beautiful relationship that it formed, right? And not only that, you were also able to highlight him and build visibility. And you said, like, the president of the hospital system, like, shared it. Like, what a beautiful story like that. And it just highlights the humanity of us all that sometimes can get lost in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Every single day we're working, we got deadlines to hit, we got people to please, that again, we forget that the humanity of us being here is to find that happiness. And we talked about this really briefly earlier about how happiness is not necessarily this thing we got to achieve, right? It's this place that we think, right? It's the purpose, right? How would you describe it? It's not like we get there and then we're there. It's
Right?
it's
I
a
think
moving target.
it's a moving target in part because we're not even that good at humans at knowing what really will make me happy. So when we start to say like, "I just want to be happy," right? And so often even parents will say like, "What do you want for your children?" Like, "I want them to grow up and be happy," but what does that actually mean? And that can actually be overwhelming because then we get stuck on this like, "Am I happy? Do I even know how to get there?" It becomes overwhelming. So instead, it's really about like getting clearer. I think like the meaning and purpose piece that you just alluded to is so helpful because it also helps us to be more resilient. So meaning is like you just mentioned when you were talking about like I could have been sad, I needed surgery, right? Like obviously I wasn't thrilled,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I was like, instead of asking, like, "Well, why me?" Right? I mean, like, I can tell you all the crazy twists and turns. We don't have time for all the twists and turns in my cancer journey. And yet, at each one, if we choose to say, not why me in like that, "Oh, this is so hard," right? We can acknowledge like this is
Yeah.
hard, but instead, like, what is in this for me in so much as maybe it will help me to do something for someone else. Maybe it will be a piece of my story that can inspire someone else who follows. maybe in this case, that surgery, this is true, was the result of a side effect of a medicine I've been on for 5 years that oncologists are seemingly using in too high of a dose. And so I'm not the only one who's having the surgery. I now am bionic. I have titanium rod and some screws in my femur. And I have used my experience to say, hey, oncologists, because I have two of them and this still happened. Hey, I think you need to talk to this bone specialist because this isn't as rare as you think it is. And so when I can actually take my experience, right, wouldn't have chosen it, it's surgery, lean into the connections at the hospital, lean into the fact that maybe I can help someone else not have to get a titanium rod. It helps me to feel that meaning in that experience. And that you want to talk about happiness, that's deeper than happiness. That sense of meaning. Steve Jobs, anyone who's ever seen his Stanford commencement speech from 2005, I reference it a lot because he talks about how we can only make meaning from the dots of our lives, like the unique pieces of our life, in the deepest way, looking backward. And so I can look at my cancer journey, for one example, and say, I did everything right. I got screened since I was 32. My mom had breast cancer. I'd always been taught, at least we'll catch it early and then you'll be cured. That is not my story. And at the same time, I can also look at it now as a piece of my story, it being cancer, that when I combine with like this corporate experience that I've had and this deep dive into positive psychology and all these twists and turns, let me advocate for others in the corporate space because I understand how to navigate it, right? I understand what it's like to be an employee with a chronic illness. I understand, and I can kind of go down and connect all these dots and say, okay, I may not have chosen this, but also I can see what the opportunity is for me to lean into here. And that's really what meaning is. It is how we make sense of our stories subjectively, but authentically. And so I ask people, so I'll ask you, I'm guessing you've heard of PTSD. Have you heard of post traumatic growth? And feel
Mm-mm.
free if you're in the chat, I have the chat open, like yes or no. Have you heard of post traumatic growth? I know there are some people who are trained in psychology here. So, but I don't know if there's a lag. I'll see the answers come in. So usually the answer I get, unless I'm in a room full of people who studied positive psychology, most people say they have not. And the thing with post traumatic growth, if you make a bell curve of resilience, right? PTSD is at the tough end, right? I'm seeing a no. I have, and so the person you have, and no, mostly knows, but if you have, I'm curious if you studied any positive psychology. So the majority of what I'm seeing is no's. And the thing is that resilience is a muscle we build. Post-traumatic growth is accessible to us. It is how, when we get through something tough, we don't only go through it, we grow through it. And actually, I like to talk about the glow on the other side, right? I like rhyming, go, grow, glow. It's very memorable. I'm big on glitter and like anything that a 5-year-old would like. But the thing is that the best way to get there, what we don't learn, this is learnable and teachable, is to make meaning out of our story, is to say, this is what my story is. Here are some of the dots of my life and how they connect. And I can actually see the meaning in that. And I can genuinely believe it. Doesn't mean you would choose that really difficult, hard thing. It just means that when you have lived through it, and it's easier when it's something, because I'll invite you to do this for anyone who likes a little bit of homework or home play, is to actually think about, and we can go back to that reframe concept, is think about a story that has been tough for you, and then think about how you might reframe how you tell it, to also think about what opportunity, what gifts have lived alongside the obstacles, what you have learned.
So, one of the aha moments that I just had as you were explaining this is that we can actually both be sad and happy at the
Yeah.
same time. We can both be stressed, but also grateful. I don't feel like work life happiness, like we can't fully talk about it if we don't acknowledge that we can actually experience both emotions. And at the end of the day, it's what being human is, right? And it's not thinking that if I'm not happy, therefore I must be sad. It's like you can be disappointed, but you can also be grateful, right? You can really be both.
You had said you're a parent, and I shared that I'm an auntie, and some of my most joyful moments like there is that coexisting to your point of, and I brought up that you're a parent because I know that all parents have felt this, right? It is that immense level of joy, and I am an auntie who is like, I couldn't love them more if they, if they were my own. So like that immense joy, and then that fear. What
Or
if,
exhaustion.
or that too. Although aunties get to say like, "Hey, here's sister who I love so much. Here are your amazing kids back."
Yeah.
But like it's that pure delight. And then what in my case, what if I don't get to see them grow up?
Mm.
Right? But part of why I feel that deep fear and anxiety is because I also know that deep joy. It is to your point about being human. It is the best gift of being human. If we did not know darkness, we could not appreciate light in the deepest way. Right? That
Absolutely.
is grief is the other side of love. All of the right, there's a million quotes
You
on these kind of things.
you kinda need both. Okay, so oh my gosh, Sally, we've been chatting for almost an hour, and like all good things, we have to also wrap it up. So if there was anything, Sally, that you wanted to leave our amazing listeners and viewers, any final tips on this theme of work-life happiness, what is maybe like one tip you would share with folks that you hope that, as we log off of here, as we turn this off and we go about our day, what's one thing that you would want them to remember? And I'll also share my own as well. But do you have anything that you want them to think about today?
I think remembering that there is this both end, right? So you can be having a tough day, and you, by learning to know yourself, getting to know yourself better, like genuinely really getting to know yourself, you have the opportunity to take that tough day and make it just like add a little spark. Right. For you, it might be writing, Jessica. For me, it might be a quick dance party. For someone else, right? The gardening, like there were so many great tips, learn from one another. But the key is to remember this happiness thing. It's not to say our life is always going to be up here happy. It's that when we get to know ourselves better, we take the wave that we all ride and we learn to get from down here up here faster. Maybe we make the slope a little bit better, and we learn to how to stay up here a little bit longer. Doesn't mean we don't then encounter something else, but the key is like, how do I right this ship when it doesn't feel good to me? How do I add a little bit of light into this dark moment? And that is really the key to work life happiness, but like we were just talking about, just to happiness, or just in general to thriving, which is the word that I use more than happiness, is just how do I learn how to steer myself, because I can't control all the other stuff out here.
My favorite tip, if I could share with anybody, is what we talked about of how we have to carve out these opportunities for ourselves. That being happy, finding happiness, creating those boundaries at work, we have to advocate for ourselves. We have to ask for it. And if we're dealing with a manager that we were saying is maybe a bit more stiff or strict, or they themselves aren't particularly open, we can find those low stakes opportunities to engage with them. And then soon enough, I bet we can slowly chip away at it, and then we can start developing this relationship with them where we can then communicate. Because if right now communications, like let's say at work or with your manager, if you're sometimes feeling it's a bit stiff or there is that friction, that's what I like to call it. Again, it doesn't mean people cannot change, right? As humans, we constantly change, which is also to say, I feel like what we're talking about today, work life happiness, it is very much a mindset, but it's also about being proactive. Absolutely proactive. So, Sally, if people want to continue to follow you, where can they do that? Where can they find you?
So LinkedIn is, I know it's how we met, and it's also my main social. So please connect or follow me here. And my website is just my name. So SALLYWOLF.com.
For those of you who do not follow Sally already, be sure to connect with her on LinkedIn. If you and I are also not connected here, be sure to connect with me. I host these every other week, and we always have an amazing guest. For example, someone like Sally to come on and we talk all things work, communications, and you know what? Happiness from time to time as well. So be sure to connect with us. Drop us a note on direct message just so we know that you are here. It's how we can stay connected. By the way, like similar to you, Sally, LinkedIn has become the place to be. And I'm so grateful for all of you who've decided, whether it was your evening, your afternoon, or your morning. So thank you for spending this time with us. I will be hosting another one of these. And actually, this is going to be in about like a week or two. And that whole topic is actually about bringing our best energy to work. So again, it's all workplace related, communications related. But for now, Sally, thank you. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I hope everybody was able to feel very, nourished with this conversation. It's a conversation that I like I just loved having, and it's so great to hear this from time to time, honestly. When some of us can just be so busy with work, talking about this is so great. So, thank you all. And Sally, thank you so much for spending your time. And I look forward to staying connected with you all here on LinkedIn as well. Take care, everybody.
Bye.